Hi, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we'll be talking about the temporomandibular joint. Our objectives here are to describe the temporomandibular joint by discussing what kind of joint it is, and what major ligaments and other sorts of connective tissues limit its range of motion, and then of course we will discuss what motions happen here. So to start off with here, the temporomandibular joint is a synovial joint, meaning that this is a mobile joint that is surrounded by a synovial capsule that secretes synovial fluid. Synovial fluid will lubricate the bony surfaces and facilitate movements between them. Its points of articulation here are going to be the condylar process of the mandible, so this part right here. It's topped off with this nice round shape, and that fits into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Anterior to that fossa is the articular tubercle, so I'm going to put that right above there, that sits on the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And that is also going to play a large role in the types of movements that this joint is capable of. In addition to that synovial capsule and membrane, synovial joints also characteristically have a suite of other structures that help to facilitate movement. One of these is a tough, fibrous outer joint capsule. And for the TMJ, this is the toughest, fibriest part of this is going to be the lateral ligament, which you can see right here in this image. It covers the condylar process here. So it surrounds the condylar process as it sits in that mandibular fossa. And it makes up most of the lateral surface of the capsule. So yes, this is an individual ligament, and yes, it is part of the joint capsule. Its fibers help to keep the movements happening here within a specific range, so they restrict posterior and lateral movements of that condyle. An articular disc is also something we find in this temporomandibular joint, and this is simply a pad of fibrocartilage that sits between two articulating bony surfaces. Typically, these are going to provide some cushioning and support for the joint, but here in the TMJ, it's also going to separate the joint itself into two compartments. So we've got a superior compartment and an inferior compartment. And as we're going to see, specific movements will occur in each of these. And we'll talk about that a little bit more after we finish up talking about the structure of the joint. Now, because this is a mobile joint, it requires some external support to ensure that it continues to move correctly and within a specific range. We identified the lateral ligament before as part of the joint capsule. And inside that joint capsule now, we will find some ligamentous connections between the articular disc, the mandibular condyle, and the tympanic portion of the temporal bone. These are part of what is broadly referred to as the retrodiscal tissue. And you can see that here in this image, and you can also see why it is broadly defined, because it's kind of difficult to make sense of anything going on there. It's a lot of tissue that is going to have attachments to the articular disc and posterior to that. And it's going to include not only these fibrous portions that connect that disc posteriorly to the joint capsule, but it's also going to contain some neurovasculature that supplies the joint as well. It's inflammation of these tissues here that often causes pain that's associated with temporomandibular joint disorder. All right, so completely outside of the joint capsule now, or extracapsular, we have two ligaments that help to reinforce the joint. We have the stylomandibular ligament, so you can see this in the top image here, running from the styloid process down to the mandibular ramus. We refer to its job as simply reinforcing the joint because it's not really in a position to restrict any sort of movement. So no matter what position you pull the TMJ into, it doesn't pull the stylomandibular ligament taut. It does hold the bones involved in the joint together though, so we include it as a reinforcing ligament. The sphenomandibular ligament, on the other hand, so here we see it running between the sphenoid and the mandible, it does have a well-defined function. It's pulled tense or taut when the TMJ is partially open, so it provides some non-muscular support for that intermediate position. Okay, I promised to explain a little bit more about the specific movements occurring in different portions of the joint, so here we go. Just to remind you, these compartments, so superior is going to be in orange, inferior is going to be in yellow. These compartments exist within the TMJ's joint capsule, and they are separated by that articular disc that sits between the mandibular condyle and the mandibular fossa, the temporal bone. In the superior compartment, so we are over here. And again, this is the portion between the articular disc and the temporal bone. We have gliding movements taking place. Now, because there is that large articular tubercle, so we have a good view of it right here, down in this image right there. These gliding movements happen on a roughly 45-degree incline, all right? And they are going to pull the mandibular condyle into and back out of that mandibular fossa. So take a look at this orange line here. The orange line is here to mark the center of the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone on both of these skulls. So they're lined up nicely right through the middle of that fossa. When the condyle glides anteriorly, or when it protrudes, it gets pulled out of that fossa. So if we take a look down here on the bottom where this is pulled anteriorly, we can see that that fossa is empty and the mandibular condyle is now sitting on top of that articular tubercle. Conversely, when we retract, that condyle leaves the articular tubercle and goes back into the mandibular fossa here. The movements taking place in the inferior compartment do not involve moving out of that mandibular fossa at all. Instead, over here in the yellow here, you'll notice that this line runs straight through the mandibular fossa again, and both of these have the mandibular condyle sitting right within there. So what we have here, instead of gliding movements, are hinge movements. So if you hinge down, you get depression and you open up the gap between the teeth. Hinge up and you get elevation, and that closes the gap between the teeth. Now, many times those two types of movements occur simultaneously to produce different jaw positions. So instead of a review question here, I'd like you to take a minute or two, pause the video, and think about what kind of movement is taking place to move the mandible into these consecutive positions. All right, to start off with here, our first position is going to be produced by depression. And we can tell it's depression because our mandibular condyle is still sitting smack in the middle of that mandibular fossa. The next one is going to be produced by protraction of the mandible. So it's already depressed. And now on top of that, that mandibular condyle has been moved up onto the articular process. Now we're closing back up again. So from a protracted state, we're going to slide back into retraction. Okay, so the mandibular condyle goes back into the mandibular fossa. And finally, our last hinge movement will close the gap between the teeth. So this is elevation. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much.